Ms Cartwright.
Thank you. My lady, please could I call Mr Gething, who appears over the link? Thank you.
Can you see and hear us, Mr Gethin?
I can hear you and see you on the screen, indeed.
And if Miss Cartwright could speak, because last time you could hear me, or the person at the other end could hear me, but not her.
Good afternoon, Mr Gething. Can you see and hear me?
I can indeed.
Thank you very much. Could I ask for the witness then to be sworn, please? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr Gethin. I'm going to take you through the affirmation. If you could just please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly, declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could I ask you, please, to give your full name to the inquiry?
My full name is Humphrey Vaughan ap David Gething. I'm commonly known as Vaughan Gething.
Mr Gething, can we please identify your Module 7 witness statement? Hopefully you've got a copy in front of you there.
I do.
Thank you. It's dated the 20th of March 2025, and can I take you to internal page 103, please? Thank you.
Yep.
And can I ask you to confirm, are the contents of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I believe they are. If there are typographical errors, I'll be happy to correct them during the course of the evidence.
Thank you. Now, in fact, Mr Gething, this is Module 7, and in fact, that witness statement represents your 7th witness statement that you provided to the inquiry. And it's right, isn't it, also that this is now your 4th appearance before the inquiry giving evidence in respect to different modules. So you've previously given evidence on the 20th of November, the 11th of March 2024, and the 4th of July 2023.
I think that's right, yes.
Thank you. I appreciate, Mr Gething, you've previously been identified and your background also, but it's right, isn't it, that during the pandemic you were acting the role of the Minister for Health and Social Services and the Minister for Economy?
That's correct.
Thank you. And it's in respect of that role that I'd be asking questions, but perhaps again just to give some context by way of your background. Could I ask you, Mr Gething, just to give your relevant background prior to March of 2020 by way of your political experience, please?
I was previously a Cardiff councillor from 2004 to 2008. I was elected to the Senedd in May 2011. I then was appointed to the government in 2013 as a deputy minister. I joined the cabinet as the then cabinet secretary for health, wellbeing and sport in 2016 after the Senedd elections. I can give you a fuller CV, but it's covered in my statement at paragraphs 6 and 7.
No, thank you very much indeed. And I appreciate a number of these topics have been previously touched upon in other modules, but can I ask you and capture from your perspective, bearing in mind you had the ministerial decision-making role, as to where you access your scientific advice from, particularly in respect of the pandemic and decisions relating to test, trace, protect, please?
So we have Chief Scientific Advisors for Health, and I understand we've got a statement from Rob Alford, who was the Chief Scientific Advisor for Health at the time. That's in addition to the structures that are created, so the technical advice cell and the technical advice group, and they overlap a little. So they provided reports looking at the science. They synthesised for ministers and others lots of advice internationally, including from a UK perspective around SAGE. Rob Alford or Fliss Bennett, I think, were observers at various points in time on stage as well, and participants. And that's all allied to and taken account of together with the advice we get from the Chief Medical Officer. I understand there's a distinction between medical and public health advice and the science, but that's the advice that is primarily coming towards ministers for us to consider.
Thank you.
Gethin, I'm sorry to interrupt. The stenographer's having trouble. It may be something to do with using the link, but if you could speak more slowly, I think it might help her capture every word.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will try to, my lady.
Thank you.
I don't know whether it's when you move your head to the side, Mr Gething, that some of your answers drop out. So I don't know whether the microphone that amplifies you, maybe if you keep a fixed position towards that, it might help.
Let's try.
Thank you. And Can you assist us then in particular, because I'm going to explore with you, please, the decision that was made essentially by the Welsh Government in line with the UK Government on the 13th of March to essentially stop all testing in Wales, but also to stop contact tracing. And Module 7 wishes to explore this because plainly infrastructure and capabilities potentially differs across the four nations. And so I want to ask, first of all, in respect of the contain to delay, your full capture, please, of what was considered at that time, please. And can we move then to your paragraph 104, where we deal with the decision making? And it's at page 23, paragraph 104, please.
So things moved quite rapidly in the previous 2 weeks, where we started to have our first cases being reported in Wales and also the case numbers growing in the UK. We'd agreed a coronavirus action plan across the four nations that had these different phases, including contain and then delay.
Can I just ask you to slow down a bit, Mr. Gething? I think you're speeding up again, please. Thank you.
Sorry. So the UK government decides on the 13th of March that it will cease community testing because it has sustained community transmission. The agreed move from contain to delay talks about the number of different phases in trying to deal with the pandemic. In Wales, we carried on with community testing for a few days more, which I think I cover in the next couple of paragraphs in my statement. But I think it's the 13th of March when I announced that the NHS is going to cease a range of standard activity. So it's quite an important day with lots of decisions made about how much more serious the pandemic is. And this is really driven by the fact that COVID-19 is now established in the UK and spreading. It's at a slightly different point, though. So essentially, most of the importation is taking place largely in the southeast, not just in the southeast. So it's moving essentially west and north across the UK. The importations in Wales largely took place actually from the February half term, from people returning from Europe. So we had our own direct imports into Wales for the virus, and that's what is taking place. So paragraph 104 of my statement covers both what's said at the meeting on the 13th of March, the COBRA meeting, and the move from contain to delay. I also set out here, you'll note that we stopped community testing in Wales on the 17th of March, based on Public Health Wales advice. But as I've just said, it's the day when I announced that a number of measures will be taken in the NHS to allow the NHS to get ready for what we believe is coming.
Thank you. And can I then capture from your perspective, because obviously you were involved in that decision and the UK COBRA meeting, but can you give us your perspective of what existed by way of testing capacity and capability in Wales as at the 13th of March, please, of 2020?
I think we had hundreds of tests available each day at the time, as opposed to thousands and thousands. I'm sure there's a chronology to correct the understanding, but at that point, for the contact tracing that we're still doing with community testing, we had enough tests and indeed tests at the front door of the health service. The move from contain to delay, and then in Wales, the ending of community testing, is really about the progress of the virus. It's about the fact that you're in a position where the advice changes on how to deal with it. So rather than trying to contain it by contact tracing and isolating people, getting anyone with symptoms to get a test, I think it moves into paragraph 105, where I talk a bit more of the Public Health Wales advice, that is that if you have symptoms, stay at home unless you're too ill, then contact NHS 111. And that broadly means that you'll then be given advice on whether to attend the health service or if you'll be given a test. So, this is in the last few days in the run to lockdown that came quite quickly, actually.
Thank you. Can I then ask the same question from the perspective of what capacity there existed in Wales as at the 13th of March in respect of contact tracing? And obviously you talk about the local contact tracing availability, but can we please just solidify your evidence about that as a resource in Wales as of the 13th of March 2020, please?
So as at the 13th of March, we were still in a position where we were contact tracing from new confirmed cases. That was being undertaken by Public Health Wales. And I don't think it was on the 13th, but I think within a day or two I did visit. It's covered in my statement. Forgive me, I can't remember the paragraph. I visited the Public Health Wales Centre and I met the chief executive and a number of people, and they talked me through what they could see happening and the staff who were doing the contact tracing. The challenge is, I think I've covered this in the statement, that Public Health Wales and the system they had was fit for purpose for a localised outbreak. And I'm going to give the example of the Llwyn Hendy TB outbreak. They could contact trace a community outbreak that could have dozens potentially of people with contacts. But as community transition becomes more sustained, their resources to do that can't match the test they're being asked to meet. So they're redeploying people. And because they don't have the capacity to do that, there's a challenge about whether that's the right thing to do. And in any event, they're starting to say this isn't a sustainable position. So on the 13th, we're not in that position. By the time we come to community testing ending, there's a recognition that Public Health Wales can't carry on community testing and contact tracing and still doing the job that's required. And we're into sustained community transmission by then. And that, I think, I cover in paragraphs 105 and 106 of my statement.
Thank you. And can I ask you, you've obviously mentioned an earlier TB outbreak and learning from that. I think there was a specific recommendation arriving from that outbreak linked to contact tracing. Are you able to assist in terms of the learning from that earlier TB outbreak, if that had been responded to by reference to contact tracing?
I can't assist you with that specific point. And about whether Public Health Wales were able to expand their contact tracing abilities or not.
Okay.
But a TB outbreak that was localised, or even a measles outbreak, are entirely different to the challenge that we faced with COVID-19.
Thank you. Can we then please go and display your paragraph 109, please, at page 26? You tell us that on the 21st of March 2020, you issued a written statement to update on testing capacity in Wales. Public Health Wales at that time had capacity for over 800 tests per day, and the ambition that you had was for 6,000 tests a day by the 1st of April, 8,000 by the 7th, and 9,000 by the end of April. So I'm just going to pause there, but if that can remain on the screen, please. Can I then ask you, please, Mr. Gething, when did the serious planning around upscaling the testing ability in Wales start, please?
So Public Health Wales were the lead body before the pandemic, and they had been doing work on trying to increase testing capacity. And I know that in the witnessing provided by Public Health Wales, and from Girish Shankar and Rob Howe, I think, they go through in some more detail the work they were doing. So this is one of the definite points of learning is at the start of the pandemic, Public Health Wales are operating and doing this work as if it's an enhanced incident as opposed to a nationwide challenge. And I say that in the sense that they were trying to deal with the challenge and they were giving us their best understanding of what they'd be able to do. I think in the statement of Dr. Shankar and Dr. Howe, they go through about the different groups of people they were talking with, the different platforms they were trying to increase, and of course the significant chunk of this that was the 5,000 tests that they thought they'd agree with from Roche on. And so Public Health Wales tell us this is what we think we can do, and we then, I say we as in the government, me, issue a statement saying this is what we think we'll be able to do. So there are lots of questions about testing by this point. So only some of this is really about the uses for testing at that point in time. It's really, even by then, an understanding that if you're going to have sustained community transmission and community testing is going to come back, you need a much bigger testing infrastructure. And so this is about the scale-up that needs to take place. Unfortunately, as took place, the scale-up didn't happen. Some of that is down to the Roche agreement that never was. And some of that is also, and I think this is covered in other statements, as I've mentioned before, that some of the alternative testing platforms that were ordered didn't actually come through in the timescale that had initially been expected. So we have to take a number of steps, and including, I think there's a military assistance team review that goes through this as well. So I think the suggestion on the expansion was more optimistic than fired in hard reality about what it would definitely be able to do. Now, some of that is because there were things that were outside people's control, and some of it was that the Roche agreement wasn't nailed down and legally enforceable, and those tests went elsewhere.
Thank you. And I appreciate her ladyship, and you have touched upon the Roche agreement, but can we just deal with what you've recorded at paragraph 109, and appreciating that we may be only able to take this evidence some distance. You tell us that you agreed the figures based on a recommendation by officials and Public Health Wales in March to increase testing capacity. The recommendation used figures from Public Health Wales, which was in discussions with Roche Diagnostics Limited to procure test kits. And just pausing there, were you party to any of those discussions with Roche Diagnostics?
No, it was Public Health Wales directly dealing with Roche.
Thank you. And you go on to say the political pressure to give numbers on how quickly and by how much testing would increase was understandable, but there were a number of elements which we could not control and which could not be incorporated into a numerical target. The numbers stated were the best estimate of the available capacity if we were able to increase capacity in line with the work that Public Health Wales led. The objective was to increase available capacity and set out the timeline. And you have already referenced Roche on a couple of occasions. And so can you help us understand from your perspective at that time how you were accommodating the figures that you anticipated you'd be receiving as tests pursuant to a potential contract with Roche, please?
So the Roche tests would have been 5,000 tests a day. So that's over half of the increase in tests that we were expecting to be able to achieve.
Thank you.
So it takes up the biggest part of it, and when that doesn't happen, obviously, we're never going to get to the ambitions that have been set out. And, there's plenty of lesson, and I'm really keen not to point fingers at people. It's what happened. And in normal times, when you're having discussions about wanting to do something and you reach the depth that Public Health Wales say they did, you'd expect to be able to rely on that. But once you say that in public, it takes on a different form. And I think there were plenty of people bruised by it, but we just had to get on and deal with where we were.
Thank you.
But it was challenging.
Thank you. Can I then ask you, before March, when essentially it could be seen certainly from the January onwards that something was coming that needed tests and the PCR tests, did you have any direct discussions with Public Health Wales about the scaling up of the testing capacity within the Public Health Wales laboratories and what additionally that could harvest by way of available capacity?
So from the January, when there was an incident, it wasn't clear that coronavirus would arrive in the same way that it had done. And I think collectively across the UK, because SARS and MERS hadn't been worldwide issues in the way they were in Southeast Asia, there was a view, and I think this has gone through in the evidence of multiple chief medical officers, not just Frank Atherton, but the view was that it was something to be to keep an eye on, as opposed to plan to have to expand testing the way that we did. Public Health Wales and their evidence do set out that they were looking at how to increase testing capacity and how laboratory tests were developed that would allow you to understand if someone had COVID or not. The challenge of what was being done by the NHS laboratory network was largely run by Public Health Wales. There was scale-up that took place, and I think in later documents it goes through the work that they're already doing. So as we go through the pandemic and the need to increase tests, Public Health Wales are telling us in the government with the Chief Medical Officer and directly in some meetings with myself, Andrew Gurvandy, the First Minister, what they're doing and what they think they'll be able to do. And that's the basis of the announcement that I make. We continue, despite the Roche issues, to try to increase capacity, and by the end of May, we have significantly increased capacity across our own NHS Wales network. But the challenge is, in this period of time, the fact that we weren't able to go as fast as we had anticipated and as announced in public.
Thank you. Can I ask you, please, Mr. Gething, just to keep your voice up? I'm struggling slightly. Your voice tapers off a little at the end of your answer, so if you could perhaps keep your voice up, please. Thank you. Can we then move along? And I'm not going to deal with all of the chronology of the detail you've set out within the witness statement, but can we look, please, at paragraph 115, please? You tell us that
Yes.
following 115 on page 27. Thank you. Following ministerial advice, you agreed the first national COVID-19 test plan, and this was the start of the Test, Trace, Protect programme in Wales. And you tell us that the national COVID-19 test plan was developed under the direction of the Chief Scientific Advisor for Health, Dr. Rob Orford, and with the benefit of contributions from a range of stakeholders and experts. You tell us that the plan proposed 6 work streams, which included Public Health Wales leading on increasing testing for COVID-19 infection through PCR testing, with the priorities being to test patients, vulnerable groups and frontline staff. And so can I ask you then, please, you'll know that one of the issues that's particularly important to the COVID bereaved families for Justice Cymru is the availability of tests in respect of asymptomatic transmission. And I think you've been asked about this before, but can I ask you now to turn to your paragraph 175, please? Thank you. So we're at page 49, please, paragraph 175.
Yeah.
Now, essentially, this is really where you land about whether or not there could have been asymptomatic testing. I think before it was introduced on the 18th of May of 2020, you say this: looking back at this period, I do not think it would have been practicable to adopt a more precautionary approach and implement a programme of asymptomatic testing at the early stage of the pandemic. Our understanding about the value of asymptomatic testing was still developing, and the advice I received at the time, to which you've obviously given the run up before we get to this position, did not advise that testing should be required of those without symptoms. If I had chosen to do so, despite the public health and scientific advice, then I would have consciously chosen to move resource away from identified and understood priorities. More so, I could have potentially increased harm if tests had not been available for identified high-risk areas. Had the advice in fact had been to implement such a programme, the testing capacity was simply not available at the time to implement it, and there is no value in adopting a policy which cannot be implemented. And please, Mr. Gething, if you can allow me to explore the theme of asymptomatic testing and transmission. But before doing so, can I just be clear? We know that 18th of May 2020, the policy changed to permit the testing. But can I be clear? Is it your position that there was no point prior to the 18th of May where there would have been sufficient tests available in Wales to have tested those without symptoms?
Well, I think it depends which cohort of the population you're looking to test, and that's the point. So our understanding of asymptomatic testing progresses, as I set out in this paragraph, from a point where the advice is only test people with symptoms, to then being there could be a case to test asymptomatic people, but actually you should still prioritise testing for these groups of people with symptoms, and in particular vulnerable people coming to admission in a hospital. And we also have the challenges of testing on discharge, because there was a real risk that discharge from the hospital to the care home environment would cease if we weren't able to test on discharge. And what I'm trying to set out in this paragraph is that when our evidence changes, and we also then have an increase in capacity. So when we don't have the capacity, I know there are some who said we should have been testing asymptomatically at a much earlier point. But at that point, the advice and the evidence wasn't there to test asymptomatically. If we had had that evidence, we would have had a very practical challenge of how to prioritise the tests. And so even if we had had that advice at a much earlier stage, we would still have had to prioritise about who we were testing and why. And it's as we go through into May that our testing capacity has started to significantly increase, both from the UK portals that are starting to become available for tests being sent out, as well as the increase in NHS Wales testing capacity as well. So I'm trying in this paragraph to honestly reflect that journey of the state of knowledge at the time, and even looking back what we would have done with the limited capacity we had that was starting to increase.
Thank you. And can I ask you then to get an idea? We know that the Lighthouse laboratories in the United Kingdom, so the 4 that were operating from April of 2020, were starting their increase in scaling up of testing. And so looking at May of 2020, are you able to give us an idea as to how many tests through the National Testing Programme and through the Lighthouse laboratories were being provided to Wales in May of 2020, appreciating it's very early days of the Lighthouse laboratories?
No, I couldn't tell you offhand, but I'm sure that we could find the figures for the practical increase in testing availability, because I think in later documents there are documents that refer to the amount of tests. I think I saw a document that talked about 2,100 tests being available from NHS Wales at the start of May, and that then increases in the next couple of weeks. But we do that. By then, we're starting to get access to Lighthouse labs as well. And it's through these early few weeks in May that the home testing routes are opened. And so tests can be sent out and then returned to Lighthouse labs. So forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think at the start of May we had 2,100 tests available each day. And that increases in the next few weeks. So by, I think, the 3rd week of May, we're into several thousand more. But if it's an important point of accuracy on each day, then I'm sure we can find correct figures.
And I'm sure all of that data is available for us when we do the interrogation work, Mr. Gething. So broadly speaking, we've captured your view about testing availability, but I want to then come back on the asymptomatic point, please, to understand the advice and the understood position in May of 2020, because it seems there was dual considerations. You've already dealt with capacity, but can I ask you then, in terms of before May of 2020, from your perspective, had anyone provided advice to you in terms to the effect of this is a serious issue of asymptomatic transmission that needs to be addressed because it is a particular issue for healthcare workers?
Not in those bold terms. So, and there's, I think, the points that are made by both Frank Atherton and Rob Orford about the difference between asymptomatic infection and asymptomatic transmission. And there was a Diamond Princess incident, a cruise ship where a number of people tested positive but didn't have symptoms. So this wasn't a position where people denied the possibility that anyone could have COVID without symptoms. It was more about, are you able to infect other people if you don't have symptoms, and the changing state of knowledge at the time. And as it became, it's not just possible, but more likely that some people without symptoms can transmit the virus, it's still then, what do you do with the resource that you have? But the advice was still very much up to the end of April, towards the end of April, that the case had not been made for us in terms of the advice that we received as ministers to make decisions from either our public health advisors or indeed our scientific advisors. There was a compelling case to test asymptomatic individuals. By the end of April, though, at the end of April, we are coming to a very uncomfortable couple of weeks and changes in policy and announcements made in England. And this is particularly difficult because I know that our chief medical officer was unhappy about the way that announcements were made without there being a discussion between chief medical officers about why the position had changed. And I've covered this in both my Module 2B evidence and indeed in this statement as well. But the state of knowledge and the advice provided to ministers changes over this 2 to 3 week period fairly significantly.
Thank you. And is that to address really the fact that the testing for asymptomatic healthcare workers essentially came in at a later date to that introduced in the United Kingdom?
No, sorry, I'm trying to understand the question you're
Sorry,
asking.
so the question is, I think you've just indicated there's concerns about the advice and sharing advice with the Chief Medical Officer. And what I want to ask you is that answer that you've just given, that had there been clarity about what the United Kingdom was doing, there might have been a similar response and policy implemented in Wales rather
mean
than
England?
In Wales, in Wales would have been come online in line with the United Kingdom government rather than the later date on the 18th of May.
Yes, we were finding out things as they were being announced. And the frustration is that chief medical officers are talking, health ministers are having a weekly call, and yet actually the evidential base isn't being shared in the way that it's then being used to justify announcements. That's one of the challenges about having to do with announcements on the hop. And then from a point of the criticism that is then made is this is happening across England rather than this is a change in policy. It will take time to implement. And actually, I think we could all have moved at the same speed if there had been rather more informed and trusting discussions, which, like I said, it's not just in my evidence, it's in the evidence of a range of others, including our own chief medical officer at the time.
Thank you. And then can I ask you, with what appears to be from that answer a degree of frustration about what was happening at the time, essentially you finding out at the time of announcements being made by the United Kingdom government, and to use your phrase, finding out about decisions on the hop, did you challenge and give feedback about that and that being unacceptable by way of a partner who equally needed to be cited on matters before they were put in the public domain?
Yes, and I wasn't the only one. You know, health ministers talked about it, and I wasn't the only health minister who said that this isn't how things should be done. And I think in the notes you've got a meeting that took place on the 30th of April where Frank Atherton is unusually robust in expressing his disappointment at a meeting with other CMOs about what's been happening and announcements that are being made. And there's a human part to this, you know, about the frustration of I shouldn't find out this way. But actually, it matters when you're still trying to take the public with you and about trying to trust you on really significant choices you're still having to make. So,
Thank you.
There's a point of learning that I've gone through in more than one part of my evidence, in this module and others, about governments, plural, regardless of the political differences, needing to trust each other and share information on a much more timely basis.
Thank you. Now, you've referenced steps that Mr. Atherton took, but can we just be clear who you took that issue up with when you were raising the concern? Is there an identifiable individual where you were saying this is simply not acceptable?
I'm sure that I raised it in one of our Four Nations Health Ministers' calls, and I'm confident that I wasn't the only health minister that raised it. Jean Freeman was also pretty robust when announcements were made by the UK government for England.
Thank you. And
time.
Sorry, I interrupted the end of that answer and it drifted off. But can I ask you then, when you were raising that concern, was it also through the context that you've just said that it was as important then that the public had confidence in the decision-making of the respective governments?
Yes, it was a point that I regularly raised in a range of fora, not just on this issue, but on other times where UK government choices were made for England, and they were news to us when they were made. Because if you're doing an interview, as I regularly did, I did media rounds late at night and early in the morning, and you're then asked, why has this decision been made and why aren't you doing it? I think it's a terrible answer to say, because I didn't know and no one talked to me. That is no way to maintain public trust and confidence at a really crucial time. So it isn't really about the politics of it. It is actually about the job is too serious at this point in time, and we can have all of our disagreements, but on this we should at least be able to share information to make sure that you're not put in the invidious position of looking like you're having, you're taking an opportunity to score political points rather than actually just saying to the public, health ministers don't talk to each other and don't know what's going on. That's a really poor position to get into, and I think the watching and listening public would rightly be concerned about that.
Thank you. And did the dialogue between health ministers improve throughout the pandemic?
Well, health ministers regularly talk to each other, even when we didn't agree with each other. So even in an instance like this, where, I think quite rightly feeling bruised and annoyed, and I'm being polite about what's happened, you still need to turn up and talk to your colleagues across other nations, because the alternative of walking away is worse, because then you really don't have a way to try and share things and try and get things right. So you can't express all of your frustration in public at the time, because that isn't always very productive, and that's hard because politicians like to express their frustration in public, and I recognise I'm guilty of that sin on occasion.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Gething, I'm just going to complete the topic on the asymptomatic point and knowledge and advice, please. You've obviously already referenced in giving your answer to the Princess cruise, which was February 2020, that I think it identified a high volume of transmission asymptomatically. I think it got near to the figure of 50%. So is it likely then, from what you've said, that you would have had some knowledge about that in February 2020 with you volunteering that information?
Not in February 2020, because that isn't when it was reported or brought up to me. But as we came through April, certainly I was aware there'd been an incident on the cruise ship that had been reported to me. Then started to see the studies that England had relied on to shift their position on testing as well. So I certainly wasn't aware about the Diamond Princess in February 2020, and I don't think the paper had been written at that time either. Okay,
thank you. Well, can we then look at the ministerial advice from the 8th of March, please, which is INQ 235863. That's INQ 235863. Thank you. This is ministerial advice a year later, the 8th of March 2021. And if we can turn to page 2, please, to just see the identified volume. I think it identifies a third of cases are asymptomatic. Thank you. We can see reference to May of 2020 again. The scope and scale of contact tracing should include the rapid testing of all suspected cases of COVID-19. Contacts of positive COVID-19 cases have only been advised to date to take tests when they become symptomatic, unless they're part of a separate scheme under our testing strategy. And so can I then take that down, please, but ask you then, and this is information that sort of builds on what you said in Module 2B. I think Mr. Drakeford, we're aware of, spoke to the Senate on the 24th of March 2020 and gave the information to the Senate that while you're asymptomatic, you could be passing on the virus onto somebody who's much more vulnerable, and that fed into the decision to stay at home. Were you aware of that position as of about the 24th of March 2020?
It was a possibility. Yes, this is definitely 24th of March 2020, not 21.
We're 2020 now.
Yeah, and so we're asking people to stay at home. That's when we're starting to go into lockdown. That's all the choices that are being made at that point about why does everyone have to stay at home.
Thank you. Can I then take you, please, to the ministerial advice from the 30th of April 2020, please, which is INQ 336477. That's INQ 3. Thank you. So, ministerial advice now, 30th of April 2020, and if we can turn in that document, please, to the second page. I think it identifies that 25,000 extra tests would be needed to test an asymptomatic care homes residents in Wales, and that choices need to be made about how to deploy testing capacity, which inevitably means trade-off. So certainly by the end of April, would you agree that there seems to be knowledge developing around asymptomatic testing needed in care homes?
Yeah, and this advice sets that out. On the next page, it isn't on the screen, it goes through.
Thank you. Can we turn to the next page? Thank you.
Yeah, so it goes through more of those numbers and the support for the sector, and it then looks at the bottom of this about what's happening in England. And the announcement that the department make in England, I think I saw a later note that it would take 4 weeks to get through the testing that they announced in England.
Yes.
So we then have to think about what are we going to do? What is our access to the different routes that are available? And so there's the point about maintaining confidence as well as what our advice tell us about what the right thing is to do. And this is giving me a summary of those different factors with the recommendations at the end of the advice.
Thank you. That can be removed from the screen, please. Mr Gething, we appreciate also that an opening statement was made by the Welsh Government that essentially lands that before essentially the decision was made, it probably wouldn't have been possible to have made a different approach on asymptomatic testing sooner. But can I be clear from your perspective, looking at that advice from April of 2020, and in the knowledge that there's a further 18 or so days before it was introduced in Wales, would you accept that there was a potential for at least 2 weeks earlier for testing, asymptomatic testing, to have been introduced in Wales?
Well, there's always a potential, but that advice in the next page, it wasn't on the screen, goes through the choices to try to make. So it does say at that point, if there's a single case in a care home, you should treat it as an outbreak and test everyone in the care home, staff and residents. It then goes through the challenges of surveillance testing, where people can request tests by getting access to the, it's called the home delivery portal, but of course a care home isn't a home in the traditional sense for staff, certainly. So we're going through then what we're trying to do about making testing more widely available in line with our understanding of asymptomatic transmission and the risks at the time. It's always possible, when you look back in hindsight, that you could have introduced the policy earlier. And given the state of knowledge we have now, then as soon as we had the capacity available, then yes, it would have made, there would have been a proper case for providing testing on a different basis that we eventually moved to from the period of the end of April to, I think, the 16th to the 19th of May, when the policy position has changed. And that's pretty uncomfortable because you're trying to give assurance to people. And actually, you need to be able to move as the evidence base changes around you. And this is exactly one of those instances where, as the evidence base changes, you have to shift your position, because otherwise you're doing the wrong thing in the light of the evidence that's around you.
Thank you. And can we then, in the context of that question around an ability, and I know you've identified hindsight has to be considered here, but can we look please at INQ 000530-780, just in terms of capacity as at the end of April, please. Thank you. And I think if we go, thank you, we can see there the capacity that existed at the time, but also availability. And I think it's right, isn't it, that essentially during this period of time there was greater capacity in Wales than was being utilised, so there would have been available capacity.
Yeah, and in fact, I think you've got emails that show that, I don't know if it's this set of figures or a different one, but I ask officials what is happening. Why do we have capacity that's going unused? When actually we know that we've got a range of policy challenges we're talking about, and we're not making use of the capacity we have. Why on earth is that? I don't have the number of the document, but I know it's in the pack. So it isn't as if there's either a complacent or sort of lackadaisical view from me as a minister. I am both asking questions about what is happening with our ability to scale up our testing, and also why we're not making more significant use of the capacity we have, and that is set out in the documents from the time, as opposed to a matter of hindsight about why are we not using more of these tests that we have available to us.
Thank you. And I think, can we just display, to deal with the point of underuse of capacity, please, 136 804. That's INQ 136804. Thank you. And can we move within this ministerial advice of the 5th of August 2020, please, to internal page 7? I think, again, we can see essentially the summary there that indicates availability and underuse of the tests that did exist in Wales that continued until the August of 2020. So is this a further illustration of, even following on from May onwards, that Wales did have more tests than was being utilised by individuals within Wales?
No, the situation is quite different by August. So in April and May, we're coming towards the end of lockdown. Prevalence is still relatively high compared to August. And we're then thinking about what then happens when you look to start easing, as well as trying to protect the care home environment. By August, the situation is really different. COVID levels are really low across Wales. They're sort of 1 or 2 per 100,000. So at this point, part of the reason why people aren't getting tests is more than one. It's both because COVID rates are low, but it's also because people are, at this point, looking forward to more easements as we're going through what was mercifully a good summer weather-wise. So I wouldn't have expected there to have been the highest use of tests at this point in time. The real issue, though, is making proper use of the capacity we have, and that becomes more and more of an issue as we go into September and October as rates start to rise.
Thank you. And then can I ask you, in terms of the final bullet point before paragraph 15, because obviously we see now you've got the access to the Lighthouse Laboratory tests. You say this, the document says this: in the event we choose to route all asymptomatic testing of care home staff through the UK portal and the Lighthouse Labs and issues arose relating to the capacity of the Lighthouse Labs, we'd have the contingency of being able to ask the LHBs to conduct testing through the NHS Wales labs. Can you just make clear what's being discussed there about choices to route asymptomatic testing through the Lighthouse Labs as opposed to the local health boards, please?
So if you have regular asymptomatic testing, that's a predictable amount going on every week, because I think at this point we're testing care homes we moved from weekly to fortnightly, but there was a slightly higher rate in North Wales, so they stayed on a weekly rate. You've got a predictable amount of tests you're using through the Lighthouse Labs. And as I say, prevalence is low, but this is out providing some reassurance and rooting out cases that come through without symptoms. If there is a problem with Lighthouse Labs, in the earlier part of the advice, I think on the 2 bullet points above, talked about that Lighthouse Labs weren't operating at their usual daily capacity. So if there's a problem with Lighthouse Labs and you know that you need to do something, for example, on targeted testing of a care home where there might be an outbreak, you can switch away from the Lighthouse Labs to the extra capacity we've already created in NHS Wales Labs at that point. LHBs are local health boards. So if health boards were concerned about an issue within a local population or a local care home, they could route those tests through the NHS Wales Labs if there were a problem at Lighthouse Lab. Efficiency and speed at that point in time.
Thank you.
It's flexing our resource.
Thank you. And that can be taken down now, please. And I think, can I ask you then about, alongside the obviously increase of testing with the access to your share of tests from the Lighthouse laboratories, can I ask you a question about the contact tracing that then followed the increase in testing, please? And can we move to your paragraph 147, please, at page 39? That's paragraph 147 at page 39. Thank you. Now, following on from the ministerial advice of the 18th of May, you indicate that the advice was submitted to me advising on an all Wales digital contact tracing and case management platform, a rapid review of existing relevant digital infrastructure in the UK and elsewhere, had concluded that a new all Wales platform was needed to support effective and consistent delivery of the test, trace, protect approach at the scale which would be required. You say this, my understanding of the risks and benefits of an All Wales platform was based on the advice from officials, which explained that the platform was necessary as the Public Health Wales Tarian system, which had been used to trace contacts earlier in the pandemic, was not designed to undertake the scale of tracing envisaged, and the review had shown that it could not be re-engineered to cope with the task at hand. Over the page, please. I understood that the new platform would initially use the UK Contact Tracing and Advice Service website, but instead of the limited selective data collected by the UK Contact Tracing and Advice Service in England, a full data feed would be taken for users in Wales to support the more detailed contact tracing approach we plan to implement. The advice sought my agreement to the deployment of a new All Wales digital customer relations and case management platform to support overall arrangements for COVID-19 contact tracing across Wales. I agreed to this recommendation. Again, I had discussed the development of and rationale for this approach with officials before the formal advice was provided. And can you assist us then with the timing of this? And again, Mr. Gethin, whether steps to have that contact tracing service set up in Wales could have been done sooner, please?
This goes back to some of your earlier questions, Council, where you were asking about the contact tracing system and the end of community testing. So Tarian, the Public Health Wales system, is fine for a community outbreak. It's not fine for a national contact tracing effort with the much greater volumes that are required. So we have to get a new system. And there had been discussions. I remember several meetings with officials looking at the options to do that. There was the prospect of using the same system as the UK government were using for England. And there were a couple of other potential options as well. And we eventually came down to a system that I was advised, and I took and accepted the advice after discussions, that we would have a greater ability with more utility if we had a slightly different system to the one that England had. Now, the reason why our contact tracing system needed to be dealt with was because we knew the Public Health Wales system couldn't cope. We knew that contact tracing coming out of lockdown would be really important to understand where new infections are taking place and the chains of transmission. And that meant that you had to have a system that could cope with that, both the digital aspect, if you like, what I think this refers to as the customer relations and case management platform, but you also then need the people to do it. And as we're going through, actually having contact tracing available from early June is really important because of the stage we're at in further easement, so more people will see each other. There's more potential for the virus to take off again as more contact is made, and in particular for the reopening of schools, because schools were due to open for a check-in, and having a system that was working was important for the reopening of schools. So there's a range of different areas, and I actually think that going from not having a national contact tracing platform to having not just a platform but a service that was staffed and ready to go in a couple of months is a really significant achievement. You can always look and say, well, could we and should we have done it sooner? But I still think that this is a significant achievement for all the people who were involved in it, including the people who transferred and moved around local authorities and others to provide the actual service.
Thank you. And sorry,
that's where we got to.
Thank you. And with looking at this being explored on the 18th of May, are you able to help us as to when, in fact, the platform was operational, please?
I think the platform was fully operational for at least the week of the 8th of June. We opened the service on the 1st of June, so contact tracing started. But I think we did, for a week, make use of the service from the UK government front-end portal. But by then, all of the data was then coming through our own system. So yeah, that's a period of time. And, the 18th of May is when the advice comes up, but there are weeks of discussions with officials about this. So it isn't that this suddenly appears as a new thing in the middle of May.
Thank you. Can we just look at some of that earlier ministerial advice, please, which is INQ 144886, please. That's INQ 144886. Thank you. And if we just move through the document, it was one of the documents provided. Thank you. Obviously, this is looking at the range of options for the platform. And then, thank you. Thank you. Having refreshed your memory, admittedly at speed, Mr. Gething, one of the things I want to ask, and appreciating that where you've landed with my questions so far, is you were able to achieve it as quickly as you did, that you think was a commendable thing. But I just want to ask this question, please. Obviously, it looks like steps were being taken as a rapid piece of work in late April and early May to scope the main requirements for this contact tracing system, and that one of the key factors in assessing various platform options against Welsh requirements was being able to deploy it in the extremely challenging timescale of 3 weeks, noting that this requirement ruled out a number of potential platforms. And do you have any view as to, there was an ability, first of all, to have this available sooner, and if there was, to what extent that had an impact on infections and deaths at that time, please?
So I don't think this does affect infections and deaths in the first phase of the pandemic. That's because when the lockdown choice is made, it squashes the curve of infections really significantly. So it's actually the behaviour response to the public that really takes the top off the exponential curve. And that was more so than, to be fair, was expected. The level of public compliance and behaviour change made an even bigger difference than our behavioural science and public health advisors thought it would do. By this point, in May, we're thinking about the next stage of easements to gradually come out of lockdown. And so the work that starts from the very, very challenging circumstances, the end of March and early April, when we're then looking at needing to have a contact tracing service and system with the digital capability behind it, part of it is wanting something that is bespoke to deal with our circumstances, but is from a stable platform that's got a record of being used. And so that then means that you're not looking at an entirely novel system, because you'd have to test that in a way that you didn't have time to. So the speed at which this has to be done does govern some of the choices that you have practically, but because you need it to work. You can't go through a development phase and say, we'll have 6 months of trialling it. In normal government terms, doing something within a year on a national basis is rapid. We're doing this in a matter of weeks. And it's that urgency that is very much there in the work of officials and the way in which the service was created. So not having an effective service would have made a difference when we open up through the summer and go into the autumn. And if we'd got this wrong, then that definitely would have made a difference on infections and mortality, I'm afraid.
Thank you. And Mr. Gething, having scoped up and scaled up this contact tracing resource, does that still exist in Wales?
No, there is no national contact tracing service of this scale because we're in a different phase.
No, sorry, my question was unclear. I do apologise. Is the platform still available, though, for scaling up if it needs to be used in a future pandemic?
I think the learning that's there from what this system is, yes, that learning is there. And it all depends about your ability to make choices. Because if we were having a new pandemic, and say it was, I don't know, God forbid, this winter, well, all the learning we've had, you'd probably make choices much earlier about what to do, including when and how to rescale up contact tracing and how to try and get your testing infrastructure right as well. So if there were another pandemic, I would expect that it could happen sooner, because I think you'd make choices earlier to get contact tracing up and running. So in a roundabout way, I think the learning is there and I think the capability would be there, but I can't tell you what the digital platform would be available like in another 10 to 20 years' time. You're going to need to constantly look again at what's available for this purpose if we ever had to do it again.
Thank you. That can be removed from the screen, thank you. Can I then ask you a question about the contact tracing app that then was available within Wales. And it's a question really whether you can assist by way of information we have about the uptake of the contact tracing app, and whether in your role as the relevant minister you can give any reflections or insight into what looks to be relatively low uptake in Wales. Now, there may be a better version than the INQ I'm about to give, but the INQ where the graph that I want to take you to is, that I'm aware of at the moment, is 574818 at page 2. But if the better version is now available, please display that document. I'm afraid I don't have the INQ, but if not, the default position will be, please, INQ 574. Thank you. And can we expand, please, the map at B? And I hope, Mr. Gething, that you can see that clearly enough. Now, this graph is to reflect the uptake of the contact tracing app when it was available from the 24th of September of 2020 onwards. But we can see that almost universally across Wales, the uptake by way of usage and downloading of that app, save for the small pockets in the darker green and yellow, is almost at the 16 to 20% uptake for what was intended to be an app that essentially had lots of abilities, including to notify of tests, but also the need to isolate, particularly when the isolation became enforceable both in the United Kingdom, in England, but also Wales similarly made the isolation also enforceable. Are you able to help us as to any reflections or evidence you have that might assist with why there was such a low uptake in Wales?
It's a proximity app. I think calling it a contact tracing app is perhaps to overstate what it is, but it's the NHS X app that we went in with on an England and Wales basis as a useful addition, but not a substitute to the contact tracing system we'd created. As for the low take-up, I can't give you a mathematical or a scientific explanation, but I do think it is worthwhile reflecting that trust in the person promoting the application matters. And so, do you think that this will help you? Do you trust the people delivering it? And also whether or not this was seen as necessary, in the sense of, by this point, we'd already been running through contact tracing come September. We were publishing our figures. There were people being called, as well as the digital interface. And we had a pretty good record of both getting to large numbers of people and their contacts, but also getting to them pretty quickly as well. So, but I think beyond that, I'd be getting into real supposition that I don't think would assist the inquiry.
No, and Mr. Gething, I'm not asking you to do that. But can I, though, just expand about the COVID-19 app, which you're right to confirm it didn't just have a contact tracing role. In terms of, it also had other functionality, which included, if you were told via the app that you needed to isolate, it was essentially linked to the regulations that meant it was enforceable if you didn't isolate. And it also had the counter within the app that then told you when you were able then to essentially stop isolating. And was there any work then being done, particularly when Wales made the decision also? So England and Wales had determined that the isolation requirement was enforceable with essentially criminal or penalty sanction. Northern Ireland and Scotland did not do so. Was there any thought given around how that was being communicated, linked to the fact that Wales had made a decision to also make isolation enforceable if the individual did not do so?
Well, we ran a Keep Wales Safe campaign where we tried to have simple messaging about what would encourage people to do to keep themselves and loved ones and people that they probably would never meet as safe as possible. I think the risk always is that if you add an extra layer of messaging in that, about whether you're taking away from the main message what you're asking people to do, but we certainly, in press conferences and in the Senedd, we talked about the fact that there was an app. I downloaded it and used it myself. We certainly talked about the fact that the strong guidance moved into being the law and enforceable. So we didn't not talk about it, but I couldn't honestly tell you about why the take-up differed so visibly between Wales and England for take-up and usage of the app itself.
Thank you. Can I then ask a question, please, around the legal enforcement, please? And can we move, please, to your paragraph 286 within your witness statement, please? It's paragraph 286 at page 80, please. Thank you. I think you're dealing there with the fact that self-isolation became a legal requirement. And can I ask you a question linked to, please, whether you can assist? Given the difficulties some from the Black, Asian, minority ethnic community face with isolating, do you accept or have any views as to whether the measure of making isolation enforceable may have put those individuals in a precarious position?
I think the challenge was the financial support that came with it. Because, I know I've covered this in my Module 2B meeting. It definitely was part of discussions we had both in the Senedd and indeed in Health Ministers' meeting. And it's all linked to statutory sick pay as well. If you're asking people to isolate, you're asking them to do something that both benefits them and people around them as well in their wider community. Asking someone to do the right thing when you're potentially asking them to choose between being able to pay their bills or feed their family or to do the right thing for other people is an invidious position to put people in. So people who have less income find self-isolation more challenging from a financial point of view, as well as people in their own individual circumstance. If they're already isolated and going out to work is part of them not being isolated in a pretty precarious position. So the duty also came about wanting to have a new settlement after the firebreak ended in Wales, because that's the timing we're talking about here, about self-isolation, moving guidance to the law, and also we'd finally had some agreement that they'd be funding a payment that's covered here of £500. We eventually moved that to £750 in Wales to help people to self-isolate, because otherwise you really are placing people in that invidious position that I mentioned. I think the position for black and brown people is that broadly we're more likely to be in lower income occupations. So, black and Asian minorities are much more likely to be covered in this group than the population as a whole. But you need to make a choice about whether this is still the right thing to do. And in many ways, it's about the messaging that this is so serious, we are changing the law. And as I say, at this point, this is a deeply uncomfortable time because we're going to the firebreak and the politics has really taken off. It's much more contested. There's open criticism by the UK government of the measures we're taking in Wales, where there's a really different approach, sort of this lockdown in Wales is going to destroy jobs and it's not necessary. And dealing with all of that at the time is a really big challenge. And then we get to the firebreak ending and rates took back off fairly quickly. So this is very, very uncomfortable. I think if we hadn't provided a payment to help manage self-isolation, then I generally think the situation would likely have been worse, not better, with people actually complying with the requirement.
Thank you. Can we move to paragraph 200 briefly? There's this topic and then any views on recommendations, then that will complete my questioning. Paragraph 200, please, at page 57. Essentially picking up on two of the themes we've just looked at together. So paragraph 200, page 57. Now, starting with paragraph 200, you've already identified that Wales introduced an isolation payment of £500 to cover lost income that came on in the in just after September. I think it was October, the date 2020, that Wales's scheme was available. So first of all, can you assist us, having identified the importance of a payment to support isolation, why it took so long for that to be available in Wales, first of all?
Because you need to make sure that payment can actually be processed and delivered to people. So again, it's the time that it takes, and I really would wish that our citizens were faster, but you're doing lots of novel things to try and get this money out and available.
Thank you. And I appreciate also that Wales was the only that was unique from England in particular, that you increased the payment to 750 for a short period of time also. And can I ask, in terms of that decision making, were you involved in the decision to increase the figures?
Yeah, I was copied in on the advice, and of course I was still in the cabinet at the time. So in that sense, yes, but I wasn't the official decision-taking minister. I thought it was the First Minister or the Minister for Housing and Local Government at the time.
Thank you. Can we then continue with this paragraph, please? Because the question I want to ask you about, if you look over the page, please, you essentially are detailing in paragraph 200 discussions and interactions you had with the Chief Constable of Dyfed-Powys Police Force about the disproportionate use of fixed penalty notice against the Black, Asian, minority ethnic community. And can I ask you then, what action did you or other members of the Welsh Government take in response to these issues?
So it was a discussion that went through the police board. So that was chaired by the Deputy Minister for Social Partnership, and the First Minister attended as well. I think I attended a handful of those meetings. But, 7% of people in Dyfed-Powys are not from a Black or Asian background. So the Chief Constable had recognised that what looked on the face of it a disproportionate use of fixed penalties against Black and Asian origin people. So that recognition that this is a problem, I think it's positive that the police recognised it, but there's then what they do with their officers, because I think on these issues they are often unconscious, and I know that that's uncomfortable for people to still talk about unconscious bias, but it's real. And I think this is a very good example of that. I don't think that Dyfed-Powys Police Force has got lots of overtly racist officers, but this just shows that when you apply a blanket measure and you apply it to the whole population, it can have a disproportionate impact. And that isn't explained by differing levels of criminality. It isn't explained by different levels of income. It's about how the engagement and education approach moves to enforcement. And that, I think, is a lesson here.
Thank you.
And it shouldn't be a surprise either, bluntly.
Mr Gething, then, can I move finally for my questions before we go to co-participants to your recommendations and lesson learning section, please. But it's your paragraph 382 that I want to take you to, please, on page 102.
Yes.
I think you detail there, thank you, that by advising people to self-isolate without clear advice on financial support, we were essentially forcing them to make what for many an impossible choice between their family and their community's health and financial survival. It is important that we recognise the difficult position we put people in and address statutory sick pay much earlier in the event of a future pandemic. And can I ask you, would you agree that the context of perhaps the delay to give or the failure to give clear advice on financial support to people and advising them to self-isolate was something that would or should have been obvious in the planning stages and acted upon accordingly?
Well, it's obvious now, but we had not had a nationwide challenge like this. So if I'm most generous, I can understand why initially people in the Treasury and others didn't see the importance of this. But it was a lively discussion through health ministers' meetings, and I wasn't the only one who was making the case, but I certainly made the case for changes to statutory sick pay. And, it was essentially a Treasury choice not to change that. This is not devolved. I got a very unsatisfactory letter from Therese Coffey that I covered my evidence. But if you ask people to make this choice, don't be surprised they choose to keep on putting a roof over their family's head. And, if you're not going to equip them financially to be able to make the right choice for the community and the country, then, this is what you can expect. And I don't think you can say that people who are making this choice are are selfish or are deliberately making a choice that is wrong for the country, and they don't care about that. They're making a choice that is rational in the circumstances that they live in. And I think this is definitely a lesson. I think I put some previous evidence as well, my Model 2B statement, that I think that we could and should have a system where in a pandemic you rapidly change the rules to provide financial measures to support people in self-isolation. They've got to meet the reality of their financial means and obligations as well.
And then finally, for my question, on continue on the theme, we're not hearing live evidence from Dr. Orford, but we have evidence from Dr. Orford that identifies and says that unless societal inequalities are targeted by governments, then underlying structural and societal factors related to health inequality will influence the accumulation of deaths, hospitalisations and cases in the next pandemic, and the resulting policy response, particularly non-medical, will lead to other inequities. Are you able to provide any reflections on how those issues can be addressed to prepare for future pandemics, please?
Well, that's a much wider question because, he's absolutely right. COVID was not a great leveller. It disproportionately impacted our most vulnerable communities. It disproportionately impacted our least financially well-off communities. If you look at a map of socioeconomic inequality and health inequalities, the two things map neatly on top of each other. If you don't address those socioeconomic and health inequalities, then another pandemic will have a similar disproportionate impact. So all the things about informal childcare, the different links communities as a resource of strength, are part of what helped with this in terms of the spread and the transmission of it. But it is also about the fact that if you've got 4 comorbidities and you're 50 and a counterpart in a different community is in a different place, over a whole population, the person with the 4 comorbidities of 50 is much more likely to come to harm. It's not a secret. That, though, is a really big challenge that requires sustained policy choices to be made about better paid jobs in different parts of the country, access to good quality food and nutrition, exercise, diet, smoking, alcohol, all those things. And they're not one thing that I think this inquiry can deal with. There are a basket of measures that the country needs to be serious about. So I say the country across the UK, if we are going to be in a different position if a future pandemic were to strike. But I think it matters regardless when there's a pandemic or not.
Mr. Gething, thank you for answering my questions. My lady.
Thank you. I think we'll carry on and finish Mr. Gethin. Ms. Parsons.
Thank you, my lady. Mr. Gething, good afternoon. I ask questions on behalf of the COVID-19 bereaved families for Justice Cymru. My lady, I can't actually see Mr. Gething.
Mr. Gethin, can you hear Ms. Parsons?
I can see her and hear her.
Right, thank you.
I want to ask you first, Mr. Gething, about delays in introduction of asymptomatic testing for healthcare workers in Wales. Your statement refers to ministerial advice received on the 20th of November 2020, which advised on policy proposals for testing of healthcare workers and hospital staff. For your reference, that's paragraph 208 of your witness statement. That ministerial advice includes the following statement. I'll read it out. We need to build into the consideration a risk assessment approach and balance the benefits of an asymptomatic testing programme as part of a nosocomial plan with the potential to severely impact operational services, which could result in services being closed down where staff receive positive tests. Now, this advice isn't until the 20th of November 2020, as I said. The policy for healthcare workers wasn't introduced until the 14th of December 2020, and as we'll come to, many healthcare workers were not testing until March 2021. The question is this, Mr. Gething, to what extent were these delays driven by concerns that positive tests would mean a depleted healthcare workforce?
Well, it certainly wasn't a consideration for me in the sense of not wanting to test because of the impact on the workforce. You know, and we covered this a bit in Module 2B, and I know that was in the evidence of Phil Clure as well. And I think I covered at the time that I was pretty frustrated at the lack of pace in the use of the tests. You know, once you've got lots of lateral flow tests available in particular, this is about protecting healthcare workers themselves, as well as protecting their colleagues and, of course, the public. So when I made the choice to say that this should be rolled out and introduced in the health service. I didn't make the choice to say, let's not do this, because otherwise it might affect areas of operation if staff have to take leave and isolate. That's a necessary consequence of where we were at the time.
I appreciate you say that's why you made the decision then, but I'm asking about the delay. To what extent was the delay driven by concerns that there would be a deleted healthcare workforce?
Well, I think you need to ask people who didn't implement it at the time and the pace that I expected it to be. And as I say, I think to be fair, I think Phil Clure in his evidence was pretty upfront about it, about the reasons why they went at the pace they did and the areas they chose to roll it out. If you're going to implement a nationwide service, I wouldn't expect it to all be delivered on the next day, because you've got to get your systems up and running, make sure who's getting it where and how. So having a phased rollout through areas is fine, but for it to take that long isn't fine. But as you know, I think it's to everyone's benefit that I don't actually run health boards and make clinical decisions, but when I make a ministerial choice, I expect the system to deliver on that choice. And equally, if it's not happening, then I can't do anything about it if I don't know. And I don't think Welsh Government officials were really properly cited on it either. It came up much later.
Well, I was going to ask you about that, Mr. Gething. Was the Welsh Government aware that it had taken so long to implement its policy? And of course, you'll be aware that the delay happened over a critical period for Wales. Nosocomial infections over that period were incredibly high. And when I say over that period, I mean November 2020 to March 2021, when your policy was supposed to be rolled out. High rates of nosocomial infection and, of course, winter.
Well, that was the whole point about introducing the policy, to make sure that you don't compromise care by having staff who are infectious in the workplace. And I'm confident that I made this clear in my previous ends in previous modules that I was unhappy to subsequently discover that this had taken quite so long to roll out, because that was not the intention behind the policy choice. And it's an area that I do think there should be some learning on about. If you're going to do this, you need to deal with it. Because if you don't, there are risks that come for everyone. And it was a really difficult time because we had the Alpha variant, we had around to Christmas, the significant takeoff in rates, the significant increase in mortality. And it's part of the reason why we went into, all those things led into the lockdown that took place before Christmas that we've covered at some length in previous evidence.
Mr. Gething, I want to ask you about delays more widely in your testing policies, please. I'm going to give you some examples. It's by no means an exhaustive list, but we know that there was a delay in routine testing for patients being discharged from hospital to care homes. We know that routine testing in care homes was announced on the 16th of May 2020, implemented in some care homes in June 2020. And we know that routine testing of healthcare workers didn't come about, as we've just been discussing, until the 14th of December 2020, implemented much later. And as I say, those are just examples. The inquiry heard much evidence last week about the knowledge of asymptomatic transmission, that it was that it had clearly emerged in February and March 2020, and there was ample evidence by April. And the question is this, Mr. Gething, why didn't the Welsh Government take a more precautionary approach to decisions relating to testing throughout the pandemic that would have prioritised safety and saved lives?
We did take an approach that prioritised safety and saved lives, and we did that based on the knowledge we had at the time. And I've been through the real challenges of the state of knowledge and the advice we received from our public health advisor and the science about the risk of asymptomatic transmission, what it meant, and when that crystallised in the sense of advice being provided to ministers, that there should be a different approach taken. And in all of those, I've been transparent in my evidence in this module and in previous ones about when and how that took place and the fact that it was deeply uncomfortable. But the choices were made based on the knowledge at the time. That knowledge is contested, and I know that people say it should have been obvious, but actually you can see the direct advice that ministers had at the time. And that's the advice that we acted on. And that covers the choices that we made and why we made them in Wales on a whole range of things, not just on asymptomatic testing. But I recognise it's an important issue for the inquiry to hear evidence on and to look at the evidence of the advice that we are providing, the choices we made at the relevant time.
My lady, may I just follow up on one point Mr Gething has just made, and its respect to the Welsh Government acting on advice, and the group would like to know what advice was that specifically? What scientific advice told the Welsh Government not to test asymptomatically?
We had advice from our Chief Medical Officer. It was covered in TAC and TAG advice notes at the time about the value of testing at various points in time. We also had Public Health Wales testing advice as well. So this isn't an invention. There are multiple documents of advice at the time that set out that that's the advice that ministers in Wales received.
That there was no clinical value in asymptomatic testing?
No, you're confusing two different things there. The advice was that this was not a route to use the testing resources on because of the understanding about asymptomatic testing. I think you're confusing a statement made in the Senedd chamber. And I think the nuance of the cut and thrust of the debating chamber doesn't always translate well into trying to have a more forensic examination of it. Mr Drakeford, as the First Minister at the time, was setting out that the advice doesn't say that we should do this. I think if you had your time again, that would not be an exact phrase that he's used, because I think it's been misused since then. But it does cover the fact that the advice we received at the time was not to undertake a course of asymptomatic testing. The knowledge we have now, we would make different choices, and I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Parsons. Mr Thomas.
Thank you, my lady. Mr Gething, good afternoon. My name's Leslie Thomas and I'm representing the FEMHO, that's the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organisations. Can I just check, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you and I can see you fine, thank you.
Thank you. I only have one question for you, and it's this. In Dr Andrew Goodall's Module 1 statement, he said, quote, prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Welsh Government, statisticians and data scientists had minimal and ad hoc involvement in civil emergencies and the preparation for such emergencies, end of quote. My question is, to what extent did this lack of data make it difficult to address the health inequalities and disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on the Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities throughout the TTI?
I think we'd be better equipped if there was further integration, and that happened through time during our response to the pandemic. I'm not sure it would have made much difference, though, with respect, and that's because the inequalities that we talk about are not a secret. They're not unknown. The healthcare inequalities on the basis of socioeconomic outcome and the fact that Black and Asian minority communities typically are overrepresented in those least economically advantaged communities is not something we don't know about. It's like the fact that, seeing a police force with an overwhelmingly white population issuing fixed charges to 7% of its population, which is out of proportion. You shouldn't be surprised at that. Be annoyed about it and want to do something about it, yes, but it's not a surprise. I think, though, for the future, a greater integration of data and statistics will help us in both understanding in a clearer way, rather than a broad, we know this is a problem way, a clearer way about the scale of the difference, and then hopefully that will help to build some trust around why there are messages about how you want people to behave, as well as the risks. And I'll give you an example of that. Vaccination is a different topic, but on vaccine, you had a loud campaign to vaccinate teachers first, because there was this impression that teenagers go back to school, they're much like adults, and lots of vulnerable teachers would get COVID. It didn't actually happen. Actually, if you looked at the data, then taxi drivers and bus drivers were much more vulnerable with a much higher infection and mortality rate. And you and I both know taxi drivers and bus drivers, they're the disproportionate number of people that look like you and me in that trade as well. So actually, you could see where there was an issue where people were facing the public, what were the protections. Actually, they are more likely to have an infection rate. And also, given what we know about the relative mortality of COVID as well, it shouldn't be a surprise that they had a higher mortality and ill health rate. The challenge in having the statistics available is how useful they are, how reliable they are, and then how they inform policy choices.
My lady, can I just follow up with just one thing that Mr.
Quickly,
Gethin,
because going to have
very quickly, and it's this. My question was just slightly more nuanced than that, Mr. Gethin, because if there was only ad hoc data, surely more targeted data means more targeted interventions. Surely you agree with that?
It could be, but the point I'd make in response is having more targeted interventions could well have been helpful as a theoretical point. We found, though, that when you had targeted attempts at intervention, you need to be clear about what they are. Is it about testing people? Is it about who you're contact tracing? Is it about cultural sensitivity in the way you're talking to people? Those things could work. If you're talking about different rules, we found that in the first phase of the pandemic, having specific numbers of rules didn't work, and it was unhelpful in people's understanding of what they were being asked to do. But if you're talking about, could it have then informed how services then responded in dealing with the public? And I think the answer to that is yes.
Okay, thank you.
That's helpful. I'm trying to be helpful.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Gethin. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Those are all the questions we have for you today, Mr. Gethin. I think you've probably heard me say it before, but I am acutely conscious of the burden we place on people like you, asking you to come back for yet another module. And I promise you, I have told the teams for future modules, they must only ask to call a witness or place such a burden on people like you if it's absolutely necessary. So please forgive us for the repeated burden. Thank you again for your help to the inquiry, and I hope we can limit how many times we ask you to come back in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, my lady. I'm sure I'll see you again now.
I'm sure you'll. I can't guarantee. I think I'm pretty confident there'll be at least one more, but we'll try and limit the ones after that. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I shall return at 25 to 4.
Thank you, my lady. Thank you.
Drakeford, I'm sorry if we've kept you
Not at all.
waiting for a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could I ask for Mr. Drakeford to be sworn, please?
Repeat after me, please. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please take a seat.
Thank you.
Could you please tell the inquiry your full name?
It's Mark Drakeford.
Mr. Drakeford, can we identify, please, your Module 7 statement? It's dated, moved to page 97. It's dated the 26th of March of this year. And can I ask you to confirm are the contents of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Mr. Drakeford, it's right, isn't it, that this is your third occasion giving evidence to the COVID inquiry?
It is.
You've, I think, provided witness statements to every module bar module 3 to date. And Mr Drakeford, I mean no disrespect to you by only dealing with certain topics that we have asked you to attend to address today, but all of your underpinning statement and evidence will form part of the work of Module 7 and your statement will be published in full. So with my apologies for the lack of context to a number of these questions, can we then first identify, please, during the pandemic, it's right, isn't it, that you were the First Minister in Wales?
I was.
Thank you. And you became the First Minister and leader of the Welsh Labour in 2018.
Correct.
And you remained as First Minister until the 19th of March of 2024.
That's right.
And you remain an elected member of the Senedd representing Cardiff West. And on the 7th of August of last year, you were appointed the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Services until the 11th of September 2024, when you were appointed as the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Welsh Language.
That's right. That's what I do now.
Thank you. And that remains a position.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, can I then please ask you a number of questions, please? But as you are aware, we have a small amount of time together today. And so the first question I want to ask you about is under the topic of decision making. Now, you've provided the details of the COBRA meetings that you attended, and I think, in fact, the first of which was the 18th of February 2020, although we know that there were other COBRA meetings on the 24th of January, the 29th of January and the 5th of February that the Minister of Health attended. Are you able to assist as to why you didn't attend those earlier COBRA meetings, please?
The earliest of COBRA meetings focused exclusively on the emerging evidence around coronavirus in other parts of the world and the health response across the United Kingdom. They were chaired by the Secretary of State for Health in the UK government, and it was health ministers from the other administrations who therefore joined those COBRA meetings. Once the Prime Minister took over the chair of COBRA, then those meetings were attended by the First Ministers of the other three governments.
Thank you. Now, can we please, again on the theme of decision-making, please, I want to ask you some questions, please, about the daily ministerial calls. And to orientate these questions, please, could I ask for paragraph 44 to be displayed, which is at page 13. Thank you. Now, you tell us that each morning from early April, you were having daily calls at 9 o'clock with all ministers, and the purpose of this was to ensure that there was joined-up decision-making in response to the fast-moving nature of the crisis. And can I ask you then, in terms of those meetings, it's right, isn't it, that that would have not just been Welsh Government COVID response that was being considered, but obviously the Four Nations decision-making? Or are these meant to represent the ministerial calls just within the Senedd?
These are simply Welsh Government ministers. You recall that by now nobody is in the building physically. 4 of my ministerial colleagues are shielding and so are unable to leave home. I was very anxious that all my colleagues felt that they were as well informed as they could be about what everybody else was doing. This is such a busy period, which all my ministerial colleagues are discharging responsibilities that are directly relevant to COVID. And a call at 9 o'clock in the morning for everybody to make sure everybody else knows what they're facing that day and the things that they will be reporting back on the following day. Decisions are not made at these meetings. Those are made formally in the Cabinet, but this is an information exchange meeting, making sure that all my colleagues feel they are fully informed about the work of the government.
Thank you. And plainly, you're identifying all of the work of the government. Are you able to give us any idea as to how much of a priority was being given to the pandemic during these meetings in April of 2020?
But at this point, the meetings are almost entirely devoted to the pandemic. Not always completely. Brexit is still happening. At this point, there are still negotiations about leaving the European Union. Every now and then we have to attend to that because it has legislative consequences for the Senedd. But I would have said that 90% or more of these morning calls in April devoted to the pandemic.
Thank you. Mr Drakeford, can I take you, please, to an example of one of those meeting minutes, please, which is INQ 361519. This is a 1 minute's displayed. Thank you. 361519. Thank you. Now, I think if we move through this email, actually, that I think is reflecting a meeting of that day, which we can see what's being discussed. What I want to ask you is, we can see that a range of topics were being discussed at that meeting, including second home rules, finance, the agenda for the next day, including food banks and funding for local government. And so the question I want to ask, please, is, were these daily meetings giving sufficient focus on testing issues in the April time, please?
Whilst you'll see from the top of the page that testing was discussed at this meeting, pressing ahead with work currently underway to increase testing capacity. So testing would be a very regular theme in these meetings. There would be a number of very regular themes. PPE would be a very regular theme. Testing would be a regular theme. Ventilators, which we now don't talk so much about, but at the time was a real preoccupation as to whether we would have sufficient ventilator capacity, staffing capacity. We know that people are falling ill in our key public services. So those four themes you'd see, I would think, very regularly reported on a daily basis.
Thank you. That can be taken down from the screen. And then again, in terms of meetings, can I ask you, please, Mr. Drakeford, the first COVID-19 positive case was reported in Wales on the 28th of February 2020, and it appears as if the next meeting was not until the 16th of March when the Cabinet next met. Does that fit with your recollection as to broadly being correct in terms of first COVID case in Wales and then the next occasion when the Cabinet met?
I think you're right about the date of the first COVID case. Cabinet meets weekly, so it certainly would not have not met until the 16th of March. Cabinet meets every Monday and would have been meeting every Monday during those 3 weeks.
Thank you. And so in terms of your evidence, is the frequency of the meetings remained the weekly meetings of Cabinet, and that would have been the same in February of 2020?
It would have been, yes.
Thank you. Can I then please move to a different topic, please? And can we display, please, first of all, paragraph 175 of your Module 7 statement, please, which is at page 49. Thank you. Actually, it's page 50. Sorry. No, it's not even page 50. It's page 51, please. Now, it's questions really on the theme of asymptomatic testing. And I think you're well aware, Mr. Drakeford, that there is an issue and concern, in particular from the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru, about the delays in introducing asymptomatic testing at an earlier stage of the pandemic. And can I capture, and so there's clarity from your perspective, as to why asymptomatic testing was not introduced sooner, bearing in mind, perhaps if we use as an example, there was capacity of 2,100 tests, for example, on the 5th of May 2020.
Well, my recollection of the asymptomatic testing issue was this, that at the very start of the pandemic, the advice we received was that during MERS and SARS, the most recent examples, there'd been very little asymptomatic infection and even less evidence of asymptomatic transmission. And in the very early days, the advice was that there was no reason to expect that this form of coronavirus would be different. Over time, however, as Professor Chris Whitty says, slowly evidence begins to accumulate. Dr. Frank Atherton says that gradually evidence begins to accumulate, that there is more asymptomatic infection, and beyond that, there becomes evidence that asymptomatic transmission is taking place. But this is an evolving pattern in which evidence slowly moves in that direction, and the Welsh Government's policy position follows that evidence. So the early evidence is that you would not divert tests that you would otherwise use for symptomatic people to test asymptomatic people. And by the middle of May, and it's not until the middle of May, there is evidence that there is greater utility to be had from greater use of asymptomatic testing. But well beyond that, in July, the 9th of July, the World Health Organization still says that there is inconclusive evidence about asymptomatic transmission. And in August of that year, Chris Whitty is writing to the House of Commons Health Select Committee saying that the evidence is still not concluded on that matter.
Thank you. Can I then please just ensure there's complete clarity as to the sources of the advice and the scientific advice that was informing your decision-making linked to the asymptomatic transmission of testing that you've just plainly given quite a lot of information about? And so where were the sources of scientific advice that you were relying upon to inform the policy decisions around asymptomatic testing, please?
Well, directly to ministers, there will be 4 or 5 layers of evidence. My lady, this is a sort of funnel in a way, isn't it? At the top end of the funnel, there are the scientists who are directly working on the research and the evidence. By the time ministers see evidence, it's been distilled down to the evidence that you get, which tells you what other people are working on and concluding. So that evidence will come directly to ministers via the Chief Medical Officer, via the Chief Health Scientific Officer, by the Chief Executive of the NHS. So I would meet all of them weekly. And then you would have the evidence from the Technical Advisory Cell and the Technical Advisory Group, and they themselves are linked in to SAGE and SPI-M and all the other forms. But ministers aren't looking directly at SAGE agendas and SAGE papers. You're relying on the distillation of that comes to you through the people who advise you directly.
Thank you. Can I then please ask you, when obviously the decision-making and the policy changed following on from the 18th of May 2020 for asymptomatic testing, there's certainly a proportion of evidence that suggests that there was availability, so there was more capacity for testing that was being utilised in Wales, and particularly up to the August time. Was there any thought given as to the better utilisation of the tests that were available in Wales to utilise for testing, particularly of healthcare workers, in the context of asymptomatic transmission?
Well, I think that there are 2 very distinct halves in this time period. In the initial time period, all the effort is going into trying to increase the volume of testing that's available to us. We don't have enough tests, and we're trying to increase the number that we can deploy. There is some frustration. You've heard it directly from, but you'll have seen the evidence from Vaughan Gethin particularly, that we then don't appear to be using all the tests that we've got available. Now, he's offered 3 explanations for that. First of all, we're told that you shouldn't plan to use all your tests for planned use, because on any day there will be some emergency in the COVID context where you will need some spare tests that you can apply to people who you weren't expecting. Secondly, the advice was you can't run the system at full throttle every single day. You will have machinery that breaks down, you will have staff that become exhausted, you will have supplies of reagents and so on that you will run out of. So yes, you can have 5,000 tests in a day, but that's if every single part of the system is going flat out, and you can't plan to do that every day. And then thirdly, you need some tests for non-COVID purposes. So I think there are some very forensic questions asked by the Health Minister, 21 separate questions he asks as to why we appear not to be utilising the full capacity of tests we've got, and those are the answers that he gets. Later on, once you get into June, the reason why the number of tests that we have available is not being taken up is much more to do with the fact that there is far less COVID in circulation. You know, on many days in June, you're talking about 35 cases across the whole of Wales. And yet, luckily, by now, we've got 12,000 tests available. And in a way, that's, thank goodness for that, because by the time we get to the autumn, we're very glad indeed that we have built up the tests we have available in that way, even though they weren't needed in the height of the summer.
Thank you. Can I then ask a question, please, linked to the liaison between the Welsh Government and the United Kingdom Government? And can we please, to give some context to this question, please, look at your paragraph 53 on page 16. That's please. Thank you. Paragraph 53, thank you. I think this is under your section where you deal with four-nation engagement, and we can see from this paragraph that you detail that you attended the majority of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster calls, and that these were considered issues relating to test, trace, protect where appropriate, and then you provide us a context of the various calls and the like. And so can I ask us to a general overview whether the Four Nations collaboration was sufficient and suitable in your judgment at that time, please?
Well, I think those meetings in relation to TTP serve two main purposes. One is a problem-solving purpose. So I know the inquiry will have heard evidence earlier today about periods when the Lighthouse Labs weren't able to operate at full stretch, and there was a reduced number of tests available. So when problems arose, the weekly calls with Michael Gove at the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster were a chance to surface those problems and to make sure they were being properly attended to. And then the other purpose they served was a good practice sharing purpose, because we're all of us trying to make sure that we reach all the people we need to reach. And as we know, not all parts of the community are as easy to reach as others. All parts of the United Kingdom are trying different things. And those meetings served as an information exchange so we could learn as rapidly as we could from one another.
Thank you. Can I ask whether you identified any issue that we heard a little earlier from Mr. Gething, particularly when I was asking him questions about the later date when Wales introduced the asymptomatic testing on the 18th of May, which was a few weeks after the United Kingdom had done so. Was there any frustration from your perspective ever that there wasn't the shared communication on important and key decisions?
Well, inevitably there were frustrations. They are often born, as I think Vaughan Gething said to the inquiry, because everybody is working flat out, everybody is dealing at full stretch with all the things we want to, and there are inevitably going to be things that go wrong. But they do cause frustration, and sometimes, rarely, but sometimes they cause risks as well. So if you wanted my example of that, it would be that early and sudden arrival of a testing site at Cardiff City Football Club, unknown to the Welsh Government. The risk there was that no plan had been made for the results of those tests to be fed back into the Welsh NHS system. So your GP, for example, would not have known that you had had a COVID test at that centre because there was no route for the data to be transferred into the patient record. Now, I think that potentially caused risk to people. Now, it was sorted out, it was put right, and so on. And I'm happy, you know, I'm still content to say that the things that went wrong were not because anybody had malign intent, but because everybody's trying to do everything too quickly. And but in all of that, sometimes risks do occur.
Thank you. Mr. Drakeford, thank you for identifying that issue linked to the results in that centre then not finding their way onto the patient record or the GP records. And are you able to give us some idea about how that problem was fixed and over what time frame?
well, that problem was fixed by the clever people who do understand how to make one system talk to one another. It was done pretty rapidly over my recollection is only over a couple of weeks. So these were problems that were fixable, but had there been more notice at the beginning that what was a helpful development of more tests available in Wales, had we understood more about it at the beginning, we could have stopped that from becoming a problem that had to be put right.
Thank you. Can I move on, please, Mr. Drakeford, to a short topic on public communication, please? And can we have displayed before you your paragraph 315, please? It's internal page 90. And there's a section before this that gives the full context around communication. But I want to just expand some questions, please, following this statement. You say as follows: on the whole, I consider that public communication in respect of Test, Trace, Protect worked effectively. As noted above, a critical area of challenge was ensuring clarity between the position in Wales and that of England, particularly along the border. As the pandemic progressed and the national media gained a greater understanding of the areas of devolved competence, this did improve, but still remained a challenge throughout. There were also areas of challenge which were presented by particular characteristics of the population of Wales, such as the need to operate within a bilingual environment and the higher percentage of older people than the United Kingdom as a whole, who were more likely to be digitally excluded, which you've addressed also in the statement. And then can I ask you, please, building on that analysis, please, are you able to assist as to how socio-economic and cultural factors were considered in shaping the communication strategies for testing and self-isolation, particularly in deprived and ethnically diverse communities?
Yeah, well, thank you, Ms. Cartwright. So one of the key reasons why it was decided that we would have our own system of TTP in Wales is because of language. It seemed to me from the very beginning that if you were going to get a call from somebody asking you to self-isolate and being able to answer questions from you as to how you could then protect yourself, you will be more likely to act on that advice if it came to you from someone who knew the area that you lived in, who was able to pronounce the name of the town or village you were living in. And I couldn't see how that would effectively be done from a call centre in Billericay. In part of Wales that I come from, there's a village called Llanfihangel Abercowyn Ararth. I don't know how many people...
Are you going to explain to the stenographer?
I'll do my best. I couldn't see how somebody in a call centre elsewhere would have been able to have communicated effectively to that person, even if that person was happy to speak in English rather than their preferred language, which would very likely in that part of Wales be in Welsh. So, the decision to have a bilingual service provided locally is very much part of the answer to part of your question. But then there are other groups who we need to reach. And you've heard earlier about the decision of the Welsh Government to fund a cadre of frontline workers, often drawn from the black and minority ethnic communities, who could go door to door, who could be trusted intermediaries between people who maybe didn't completely understand or trust what was being asked of them, and to be able to be that bridge between the service we wanted people to use and the lives that people led every day.
Thank you. Now, the paragraph just took you to dealt with the issue that you've identified that's particularly pertinent in Wales regarding digital exclusion. And Mr. Drakeford, could I seek any assistance you can provide relating to when we know the COVID-19 app was available after the 24th of September 2020. There is information to suggest that there was low uptake in Wales. And could I ask, please, to be displayed INQ 574818. It's a map, if you were following the evidence of Mr. Gething that I asked about by reference to the uptake of the COVID-19 app. If it could be expanded, please. And I've asked all the Welsh witnesses today if they can assist with what appears to be quite a significant trend in relation to the uptake of that COVID-19 app, of almost universal low uptake at the 16 to 20%, and in a pocket of Wales even lower at 11 to 15%. Are you able to assist as to why it was that there was this low uptake of the COVID-19 app?
Well, Ms Cartwright, if this map had been presented to me in one of my research methods classes, my advice probably would have been to check the data, because I don't think that I necessarily believe what I'm seeing here. So the first thing I would have done would be to make sure that this map is comparing like with like, that it's drawing its information from the same sources, that we can be confident that this pattern really is a reflection of youth rather than an artifact of the way in which information has been collected and is being presented. That would be, if I was doing it from a research methods perspective, that's the first question I would have asked about this map. If it is a genuine representation of differential use as starkly as it seems to be there, then I think there are 2 or 3 explanations that might help to cast some light on it. One is the digital exclusion example. Wales has a higher proportion of its population in over 65, 75 and 85. And as we know, the older people get, the less familiar they can be with some of those ways of doing things. Secondly, we didn't rely on the app to the same extent in Wales. We had a very successful TTP service that people knew about. And then I think the third reason is that getting the app available to Wales and getting it to work for Wales, getting it to have a Welsh language capability, have been quite a struggle. So although we decided to go in with it, hours and hours were taken up of Welsh Government officials' time in trying to make sure that the app genuinely reflected Welsh needs and circumstances. And I think amongst the reasons, as I say, if the map is a genuine reflection, which would be my first question, then I think those reasons are amongst them.
Thank you. Thank you. That can be taken down, please. Can I then ask a question, please, by reference to your paragraph 203 of your statement, please? It's internal page 59 of your witness statement. Thank you. You detail within the statement that the social and economic impacts of self-isolation were at the forefront of our consideration of the protect element of Test, Trace, Protect. Support in the form of financial, practical and emotional assistance was funded by the Welsh Government. This included support for individuals who were isolating as close contacts, having been contacted by Test, Trace, Protect tracers. This support was provided by every local authority in Wales. And can I ask you in respect of that, how did the Welsh Government ensure that information about these support schemes reached vulnerable and marginalised groups, particularly those with language or trust barriers?
Well, we would have used universal means of making sure people knew it. So the Chief Medical Officer wrote regularly to every single person on the shielding list, for example, and then that cascades to people's families and so on. There are digital forms, the local authorities all have their websites all with lists, and the amount of practical assistance that was available was a huge range, from people who needed help with buying food, or having medicines delivered, to having the dog walked. I remember being very struck during the pandemic at how important it is for people, particularly people who live alone and who now aren't allowed to go out, that somebody comes and helps them look after, another sentient being that they have a really strong relationship with. It seems odd in the middle of a global pandemic that dog walking becomes important, but in a practical sense, it really mattered. Now, there then is the question you asked about how do you reach those communities where maybe levels of trust are less. You've got to find intermediaries who are trusted. So I spent a number of weekends with Muslim Doctors Cymru, a fantastic group of young doctors who would go to mosques and explained to people as they came in why it was important that they would be vaccinated, why they ought to follow the advice they were given. And faith groups were very often, we found, a way into the lives of people who might have hesitation in acting on information that simply came from government sources.
Thank you. And perhaps can we just display again that page? Thank you. You've obviously just identified the engagement you had through the mosques. We can see at paragraph 200, you identify that you sought input from a wide range of stakeholders, including local authorities and the third sector, in developing accessible testing provision. Obviously, you've clarified one source of assistance, but is there anything else you can assist by way of clarification as to engagement with ethnic minority-led health and community organisations as part of these consultations, please?
I wonder, my lady, whether I might make just one general point here. And it came partly from my own experience of being the health minister during a large measles outbreak in the Swansea area of Wales, where we would write to families, sometimes knowing that they were from different backgrounds. And what I think I realised is, I feel like I have been very fortunate in my life that on the whole, I've lived in a context where if you are contacted by the state, you think that's because it's got a benign intention behind it. A letter from the council is going to be telling you something you need to know. We were writing to families who came from other parts of Europe now, where a letter from the state is something to be worried about. And so instead of opening it and following the advice, people were putting it on the mantelpiece and making sure they didn't open it at all. So one of the more general lessons, I think, to be gained from this experience is that some of the ways in which we try to communicate are very culturally driven. They come because of the way we think about things, and we don't always realise that that way of doing things may evoke a very different response from people whose experience has been otherwise. And I hope we took a bit of that into our COVID response, but I think it's a more general lesson about not assuming that something as simple as a letter, which we think of as being a good way of getting hold of people and translating it into language and so on, may have the opposite effect than the one that you're intending.
Thank you. And finally, for my questions, please, Mr. Drakeford, can we please move to your lessons learning reflections on facing a future pandemic, please? Paragraph 333. It's page 95, please. Thank you. Now, you detail at paragraph 333. My view is that the first question that the inquiry might ask is whether the test, trace, protect or its equivalent system was the correct system to use in response to a pandemic of this scale. I consider that it may not have been the correct answer to make use of a conventional public health approach to dealing with communicable diseases, that were tried and tested and successful in those sorts of outbreaks, something that should be, that public health technicians were used to dealing with by simply replicating the same thing on a larger scale. Can we have complete clarity about what you're saying and what your view is here, Mr. Drakeford, particularly informed as the fact that you were the first minister that was intimately involved in what was taking place in decision-making?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to reflect at the end of the statement on any lessons that I think might be drawn. It's a might. I don't want to say it is a lesson, but I think both at the time and thinking back, I do ask myself the question whether the industrial scale of contact tracing, everything that we did, whether we got an adequate return on all of that activity in terms of public health protection. That's my first question. There's a very interesting TAC paper that came the way of the Welsh Government, I think in March 2021, that said contact tracing does work, but by far the largest effect comes from contacting the index case and getting them to isolate. And the additional protection you get from all the other contacts that you make is relatively marginal. And yet we were doing it on this huge scale. So I just think there is a question that is worth exploring as to whether or not just taking what public health physicians knew in that measles outbreak, in that tuberculosis outbreak, and then thinking that that would work, given the scale of challenge faced by COVID, whether that turned out to be the right assumption to make. And then I think the other thing that I was concerned about and would be concerned about is because we were putting such an enormous effort into the TTP system, did that prevent us from thinking about doing things differently? Were we so invested in making this work that we didn't have what is sometimes in these days called a red team, isn't it? A group of people who ask you not, is that system working well, but is that the right system to use at all? Were there other things we might have been able to do? We never did really ask ourselves that question because we were so invested in making the system that we had work. And I think in future, maybe it would be good to build into a reaction, a bit of challenge, so we don't just take the things we know about already. And public health physicians knew about contact tracing. And then they they advised us that this was the right way of responding to COVID.
Thinking of other options, Mr. Drakeford, I don't know if you heard the evidence about the Zoe app from Professor Spector, which I gather was taken up to an extent in Wales.
Yes.
But basically, the principle there is it's not test and trace, it's a symptom tracker. And then when you know what the symptoms are, including loss of smell and taste, which, as you know, weren't originally thought to be symptoms, then people got symptoms, you tell them to stay at home.
Yes. Well, I think that's a very good example. I use the Zoe app myself every day. But the first thing I used to do in the morning was to put... And in Wales, the reason the people did it, I'm not saying this isn't true elsewhere, but certainly in Wales, the best appeal to make to people is not do this because it'll be good for you. It's do this because you'll be helping somebody else. So the reason people fill in the Zoe app was they knew that if you did that, that would provide information that would help other people to know what was going on. So I think that's a very good example of something else that was happening, but it was slightly to one side of the real effort, which was making TTP work.
Thank you. And finally, for my purposes, please, Mr. Drakeford, you'll be aware that the first module report has already been published, and it's just a brief question on one of the conclusions in that report, paragraph 5.68. And obviously, you'll be aware that the UK government and devolved administrations have been identified through that first report on preparedness that could and should have invested in the infrastructure in advance of the COVID-19 pandemic, but had not done so. And if we follow it through to the end, we can see the massive cost to the nation of building test and trace systems from scratch, the building blocks and essential structure of the test and trace systems established by the United Kingdom government and the devolved administrations during the pandemic should have been maintained so that these systems can be rapidly restored and adapted for use in the event of a future outbreak. Now, I appreciate that you're no longer the First Minister, but you were up until 2024. Are you able to assist us why the building blocks of test and trace system established during the pandemic, particularly in Wales, well, first of all, if any have been maintained, please say so, but essentially for those that have not been maintained for future deployment in another pandemic, why that is the case?
Well, to answer that question directly, and it's part of what I think is quite a challenge in the first sentence of the recommendation, because essentially the recommendation is that governments should maintain a series of stranded assets, things that you are not using, but you are maintaining and spending money on in case you may need them at some point in the future. And in the world of practical politics, that is a very hard thing to do. I mean, when I was the health minister, I agreed to spend a significant sum of money on Tamiflu. which then after 5 years had to be written off because it was no longer, its usefulness decays over time. And we were very, very heavily criticised by opposition parties and other people in the public for such a waste of money. We'd invested in this, and there it was. It was useless, and that is a very hard thing to sustain in the political world. Investing in things that cost you money, not because they're useful to you, but because they might be needed in the future. In terms of the things that we did invest in, and whether we still have them, we do to a certain extent. In many ways, the human resources, I think we do still have, and we've learned a lot about how we can adapt the human resources we have, and we use that very successfully in TTP, using our local government colleagues who are not able to work in their normal jobs, but were good at talking to the public. I heard your question, I think, to Joanne Daniels about the Newport lab. I think that's a much less satisfactory story. The Public Health Wales part of that does continue to operate. The Lighthouse Labs were jointly funded by all 4 nations, because we could have chosen to have had our Barnett share and done our own, but we chose instead to have a single pot, and we could all benefit from it, and we did all benefit from it, and Wales was very glad to have access to it. But once the contract ended, the UK government alone decided not to continue to fund it. So all that investment that the public purse had made in those facilities evaporated at that moment. Had the public sector directly owned and run those facilities, they would still be available. And I think there's a bit of a lesson there too about, I know it was all hands to the pump and you had to use, other, but the contractual basis of some of those facilities meant that the public return on the money that was invested was very short-term indeed, and done a different way could have had a much longer set of benefits for the public.
Mr. Drakeford, thank you for answering my questions. My lady, there are core participant questions. Thank
There
you.
are, I think, just from Ms Parsons. But round the side of the pillar, Mr Drakeford, if you want to see where Ms Parsons is.
I can see, thank you.
Thank you, my lady. Good afternoon, Mr Drakeford. I ask questions on behalf of the COVID-19 bereaved families for Justice Cymru. I want to ask you about the Welsh Government's understanding of asymptomatic transmission. And do you summarise that position at paragraph 75 of your witness statement? We don't need to turn it up, but I understand the position in short is that up until April 2020, there was, you say, insufficient evidence of asymptomatic transmission upon which to base operational decisions. Is that your understanding?
That's right.
So there needed to be sufficiency of evidence, for example, to introduce asymptomatic testing of healthcare workers and so on. Is that right?
Ms President, I think that there needed to be a sufficiency of evidence to prioritise the use of tests for that purpose, rather than other purposes that were also required at the time.
A matter of priorities. I know you're familiar with SAGE's precautionary approach, Mr Drakeford, and given that approach, do you think the Welsh Government ought to have taken a precautionary approach in relation to asymptomatic testing?
I think the Welsh Government attempted to follow the evidence as it was presented to us. I don't think we were in a position to be wiser than anybody else about the nature of asymptomatic infection or transmission, which obviously evolved over time. The decisions we made were made in the light of the best evidence that was given to us about whether or not diverting tests for asymptomatic use was justified by the conditions of the time, and that changed over time.
So what is your answer to whether the Welsh Government ought to have taken a precautionary approach?
Well, I believe we did take a precautionary approach. And then the question is, could we have taken a more precautionary approach? And I don't think the evidence would have justified us in doing so.
Well, we know because of the Welsh Government's opening for this module to the inquiry that they've accepted that they were late on their policy in terms of testing those being discharged from hospital. So I think we can say that that wasn't a sufficiently precautionary approach there. Is that fair?
I think what the Welsh Government's statement says is that there was a delay which ought not to have been as long as it was between the policy decision and the guidance being published. So in that case, the decision was made on the 15th of April, and the guidance was published on the 29th of April, and the Welsh Government statement acknowledges that that gap should have been shorter.
On the subject of gaps, though, Mr. Drakeford, I think what's coming over from the Welsh Government witnesses is that the evidence, in their view, began to change in April, May time, hence the policy to test in care homes. But the policy in respect of healthcare workers didn't change until November 2020, and even in practice, March 2021. So that wasn't a precautionary approach either, was it?
Well, I think that's more linked to evolution of technology, isn't it? Healthcare workers were tested from the very beginning. The first healthcare workers in Wales were tested on the 7th of March. So it's not that healthcare workers aren't being tested until the late autumn. It's a question about whether you can use lateral flow tests accurately and reliably on a wider scale. There is a gap. I heard Vaughan Gethin answer questions about the gap between the policy of the Welsh Government being determined and its implementation on the ground. And I think Vaughan acknowledged that there were gaps in the advice that came to ministers about the length of time that was taking. But I don't think myself that the policy was particularly late in being developed.
But sorry to come back on this, Mr. Drakeford, why not? Why do you say that that's not late? The evidence was there, many say well before April 2020, and on your own account, by May when you changed the policy for healthcare workers. Why is November, or November through to March, not late?
Well, I think I'm not agreeing with the basic premise of your question, because I may be misunderstanding it, and apologies if I am. I think what you're saying to me is that it took from March to November to have a policy of testing healthcare workers. I simply dispute that. We were testing healthcare workers from the 7th of March onwards.
And I apologise, Mr. Drakeford, it's my fault. Routine testing, asymptomatic healthcare workers, that's the key. I'm so sorry. That's been the heading for all of my questions, in fact, asymptomatic transmission and asymptomatic testing. That came in November as a policy. Sorry,
yes.
that was discussed in November, and it didn't come in until the 14th of December.
No, thank you. I understand the question better now. And as I say, I think that is related more to the availability of a different sort of test. There was a lot of debate in Wales as to whether or not those tests could be used in that way. Would they be sufficiently reliable? Would people have confidence in them? And it did take until later in that sequence of events for us to arrive at a point where we thought that those tests could be used, and therefore that asymptomatic testing would be possible at the scale and in the way that it was after November of 2020.
But just before we move on from this, of course, Mr. Drakeford, we've been discussing that Wales didn't use up its capacity of testing in any event throughout 2020.
Well, as I've explained, I think there are two phases in that. The the summer phase is because there isn't a demand for testing. The gap between tests available and take-up of tests in the early period was raised, and I would say very pointedly raised by the Health Minister with officials, and he was offered the explanation that he was offered.
Lastly, and briefly, if I may, Mr. Drakeford, your statement highlights the characteristics of Wales, its size, political structures, strong social partnerships, and so on, and it highlights them as advantages during the pandemic response. and you underscore distinctive decision-making principles in your witness statement that prioritised trust and equality. And that's at paragraphs 19 to 24. We needn't turn it up, I'm sure you know what I have in mind. But throughout the pandemic, Mr. Drakeford, there are a number of delays in the implementation of testing policy as compared to England. I appreciate, of course, it's a devolved matter, but nevertheless, the delays are consistent and striking. By way of example, routine testing for care home patients on discharge from hospital, routine testing in care homes full stop, and routine testing of healthcare workers, which we've already discussed. Given the characteristics that you've highlighted as positive characteristics which inform good decision-making, why was there such a delay in testing decisions that I've just outlined?
Well, I think there is a general difference in approach between the way in which UK ministers made decisions for England and the way Welsh ministers made decisions for Wales. And that disguises something which I think doesn't completely emerge in the question. In my experience, the approach in England was to announce first and then plan. So you can announce that something is going to happen, but if you don't have a plan for making it happen, it actually doesn't happen. So the fact that somebody in England says everything is going to happen from next Tuesday, believe me, is no guarantee that it was happening from Tuesday. In Wales, we took the opposite approach. We planned first, and then we announced. And sometimes that makes us look like we are later doing things than was happening elsewhere. But I believe that our method was more effective, it delivered better on the ground, and it certainly, I think, explains why there were higher levels of trust in Wales between decision makers and those affected by them, and turned out to be the case in England.
And so, just so I've understood your evidence, Mr. Drakeford, does that effectively mean that you're suggesting that even though England announced policies earlier, in fact, it was just that they introduced them in reality at the same time as Wales?
Well, I think the gap is not the gap that you suggested in your earlier question by saying, something was announced in England and then 2 weeks later something happens in Wales. I think the gap is considerably less than that in practice.
Thank you, Mr. Drakeford.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms Parsons. That completes the questions we have for you, Mr Drakeford. I don't know if you heard what I said to Mr Gethin, but I am very conscious of the burden we place on you. I know you are still extremely busy. I've checked. I can't give you any guarantees that we're not going to ask you to assist us again, but I promise you the teams are very conscious that we shouldn't place another burden on you unless it's absolutely necessary. Thank you so much for your help today and for your thoughtful evidence.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Very well, I shall turn 10 o'clock tomorrow.
Thank you.